Here's the reading of pages 173 to 177. We're talking about the Han. All right, the Han Dynasty and the legacy of Confucius. When the first emperor died in 210 BC, he left an empire exhausted and ready for change. Qin Shi Huangdi thought he had founded a dynasty that would last for 10,000 generations. But only 4 years after his death, his dynasty fell in a bloody civil war. The victors in that war founded a dynasty called Han. This dynasty lasted more than 400 years. For guidance, the Han rulers began turning to the teachings of Confucius. The old sage had taught that the role of rulers is to bring happiness to their subjects, a lesson that the Tiger of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, apparently had not cared to learn. During the Han Dynasty, the Analects of Confucius and the great teacher's ideas set the tone for public life. Some emperors lived relatively simple lives. They sought the advice of scholars as they governed their empire. The Han emperors did not reject everything from the previous dynasty. For one thing, they valued the centralized government that Qin had established. Indeed, they built on what the first emperor had achieved and made it even better. Under the Han, the officials of the civil service became the elite of China. These were the men who ran the empire, some in the imperial capital, some in the outlying districts. But the Han made one important break with the past. They thought the conduct of these powerful officials should be guided by the ideas of Confucius. The Han emperors sought smart, virtuous men to help administer the government. No longer would family ties be qualification enough. A rich uncle would not be able to get a nephew a job in the government. Those who served the state should do so on merit and the basis of their intelligence and skills. To find these gifted men, the Han emperors established a system of recommendations. All over China, local officials nominated promising young men of virtue and talent. These young men went to the central government to be interviewed. To be selected, they had to show the Confucian virtues of honesty, sincerity, and respect for their elders. Of course, they also had to be able to read and write, since government work involved a lot of paperwork. Ambitious young men sought out Confucian teachers in the hope that they would gain a reputation for the Confucian virtues. All of this was very different from the days of Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin had come to power through military might, and he used the same might to stay in power. To pay for his building projects, he had taxed the people heavily, and he used force to make the people toil for him. But, as one Confucian saying put it, an empire can be conquered on horseback, but not governed from a horse. In other words, good government depends on the support of the people rather than the power exercised in battle. For all his power, the support of the people was the one thing the first emperor never had. And here you can take a look at, here's that Qin dynasty again, kind of in the purplish. The early Han dynasty is in the dark orange. And then the territories added later is in the lighter. Okay. For the most part, the Han emperors tried to govern fairly and justly, in ways favored by Confucius. In 124 BC, they set up the Imperial University to teach the Confucian classics to future government officials. Later, the Confucian classics were carved in stone in the capital city. Scholars journeyed from the empire's distant provinces to make copies of them. Setting out on the Silk Empire. The Han Dynasty did not wish to give up any territory gained by the tiger. They extended China's realm into the lands that are now Vietnam and Korea. They also extended the empire west towards Central Asia, and their influence would extend much farther to the west, thanks not to the march of imperial armies, but to the enterprise of Chinese merchants who traveled what has come to be called the Silk Road. All right, and just a couple of other things here. Part of the Imperial University set up by the Han emperors and to promote the teachings of Confucius. Very cool building. And today's Han. So glorious were the achievements of the Han Dynasty that today most Chinese still refer to themselves as the people of Han. Numbering more than 1 billion, the Han are not only China's largest ethnic group, but the largest in the world. Got a couple pages. Page 176. The Silk Road was the most famous overland trade route of ancient times, stretching across western China and Central Asia. It linked for the first time the land of Confucius with the West. By 100 BC, trade caravans loaded with precious silk began to clatter along the road toward Persia. Under constant threat from bandits, the caravans crossed lofty mountains, wind-swept plateaus, and deserts that were searing hot by day and bitterly cold by night. But the high prices paid for silk made it all worthwhile. In Persia, the silk was traded to merchants who carried it to the ports of the Mediterranean coast. By the 1st century BC, Chinese silks were for sale in Rome. Silk was the most prized of Chinese exports, but the merchants' caravan also carried spices, ivory, jade, and fine quality ceramics. On the return journey, they brought back a variety of products, including glass, wine, perfumes, linen, woolen goods, horses, and camels. Camels were the major beasts of burden along the Silk Road. Hardy and sure-footed, they could withstand the extreme heat and cold of the long journey across Asia. And then back on page 174, take a look at the Silk Road. Okay, the Silk Road there is in the red dotted lines. And what's this? One hump or two? The camels that plodded along the Silk Road were the two-humped variety, Bactrians, named after a part of Afghanistan once known as Bactria. These great ships of the desert were ideally suited to the arduous conditions they faced, while the single-humped dromedaries are fleeter of foot. Bactrian camels can endure temperatures as low as 40 degrees below zero. Wow. Let's see, the gift of paper. Silk was one of Chinese innovation made available to the rest of the world during the Han Dynasty. Chinese inventiveness would provide another. Its value is impossible to estimate. You're looking at it right now. Paper. Do you remember our friend Li? His father was a paper maker. Paper making was perfected in China in AD 105. By that time, Chinese paper makers used a variety of fibrous plants to make paper, such as hemp, bark, or bamboo. They softened the fibers by soaking them in water before boiling and pounding them into a pulp. To make a sheet of paper, they dipped a fine screen into the pulp to gather a thin layer of fibers. Next, the paper makers pressed the screen to remove the water, then left it to dry on a heated wall. When dry, the finished sheet of paper was peeled off the screen. After it was coated with salt and glue to make sure the ink applied to it would not run, the paper was ready to use. The Han civil service had a huge appetite for paper, as did the country's many scholars. Scribes wrote books on rolls of paper, among them the classics of Confucius, now preserved for the ages. With the increase in books came the growth of literacy in China. Scholarship increased, ideas flourished. It was a development that would have made the great philosopher proud. And then paper replaces papyrus. When the Egyptians had been writing on papyrus since ancient times, the Chinese invented paper as we know it. Papyrus was a mat of reeds pressed into a hard, thin sheet. When the Arabs brought Chinese papermaking to Egypt in the 8th or 9th century AD, paper quickly replaced papyrus, the material after which it was named. That's the end of reading pages 173 to 177.